The fire in Gideon Marbury's study had burned down to a sullen red glow, and the three men seated at the great oak desk had not troubled to call for more coal. Outside, the October dusk pressed flat against the tall windows of Calderne Court, and the candles on the desk threw the faces of the Duke of Calderne, his uncle Lord Bertram, and a man named Price, a proctor from the ecclesiastical courts, into sharp relief against the dark. Price had spread his papers across the leather surface with the unhurried efficiency of a man accustomed to the private dissolution of private arrangements. And Lord Bertram was reading the settlement figure aloud for the third time, turning it like a coin to examine both its faces. Gideon sat with his hands flat on the desk and listened, and if anything in his expression betrayed discomfort, it was only the faint tightening at the corner of his jaw, the kind of thing a man learns to still over 9 years of practice. The figure was modest. It was, Bertram said, generous under the circumstances. Price agreed without looking up. Gideon said nothing, because Bertram's voice filled a room efficiently enough without his assistance. The boy remains at Calderne, naturally, Bertram said, turning a page. That is not a point of negotiation. It is a point of law and of sense. The child is the heir, and the heir belongs to the estate. Price made a small mark on his document. The custody clause is standard. The mother retains access at intervals to be agreed. Monthly, Bertram said. Interim, supervised. Gideon moved one of his hands from the desk and set it in his lap. That was all. The clock on the mantelpiece had just begun its half-hour chime when the door opened and a footman entered. Not hesitantly, but with the particular walk of a man delivering something he does not understand and is therefore not afraid of. He crossed to the desk and set a sealed letter in front of Gideon. The seal was plain wax, impressed with a simple device Gideon did not recognize. The return address, written in a clear, practiced hand, named a Mr. Tobias Hawes, attorney at law, Ludwell. Bertram had not stopped speaking. He was explaining the timeline for discretion, the announcement to be made in the spring, after the petition was heard quietly in chambers, after the county had been prepared with the appropriate groundwork of sympathetic murmur. Gideon broke the seal. He read the letter once. He read it again, more slowly, and the color that left his face in the first reading did not return in the second. The letter was brief, professionally precise, and entirely without sentiment. It informed His Grace, the Duke of Calderne, that the Duchess of Calderne, Susannah Marbury, née Hale, had lodged a petition for judicial separation and separate maintenance with the appropriate court. That the petition named specific grounds including financial mismanagement of the Marbury Trust and the documented exclusion of the Duchess from decisions pertaining to the marital household and the education of the heir, and that a sealed deposition concerning the Marbury family settlement, its terms, its origins, and the circumstances under which the previous holder of the title had been displaced, was held by Mr. Hawes against any legal attempt to remove the child Robin Marbury from his mother's custody without her written consent, given before a magistrate, freely and without coercion. Price was still writing. Bertram was still speaking. Gideon set the letter on the desk. Bertram saw his face and stopped mid-sentence. He reached across and took the letter before Gideon could speak, which was not difficult, because Gideon was not speaking. Bertram read it standing up, and the change that passed over him was not pallor, but something harder. The look of a man who has made a careful calculation and found an error he cannot immediately locate. "Who in God's name advised her?" Bertram said. Gideon's voice, when it came, was quiet and entirely flat. "No one," he said. "That is the point." Price looked up from his papers for the first time. He looked at the letter, still in Bertram's hand. He looked at Gideon. Then, with the deliberate economy of a professional man who has learned when a room is finished, he gathered his documents from the desk, aligned them against his palm, and placed them in his leather case. He rose, inclined his head to the Duke without quite meeting his eyes, and left the study without being dismissed. The door closed behind him with a sound that was not loud but was, in the silence that followed, entirely final. Bertram set the letter back on the desk. Gideon looked at it without touching it again. Outside, the last of the dusk had gone, and the windows showed nothing now but the reflection of 2 candle flames, and the unreadable face of a man who had, until approximately 4 minutes ago, believed himself entirely in control of the evening. 4 days before that letter was sent, Susannah Marbury had been placing her husband's correspondence in order. It was a task she had performed every Monday morning for 6 years. Because Gideon's secretary was competent with outgoing letters and careless with incoming ones, and because no one had ever told her to stop, she sorted by sender, by date, by urgency, moving through the stack with the quick, practiced hands of a woman who had learned to read a document's importance from its paperweight and its seal before she opened it. She had been doing exactly this, standing at the left side of Gideon's desk while he was in the north field with his steward, when her fingers found the edge of something tucked beneath the blotter rather than placed on top of it. She drew it out. It was a draft, not a fair copy. Corrections in 2 different hands, one of them Bertram's, and it was headed, in plain terms, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage, Marbury, G.H., Duke of Calderne, Petitioner. She read it in full. It took 4 minutes. She set it back exactly where it had been, smoothing the blotter over it with her palm until the surface was level and undisturbed. And then she finished sorting the correspondence, set the stack in its place on the right side of the desk, and went to see about Robin's breakfast. She said nothing to anyone in the house. She said nothing that evening at dinner, where Gideon spoke pleasantly about the drainage in the north field. And she replied pleasantly about Robin's new word, horse, clearly pronounced, with great conviction. And the candles burned down between them in the ordinary way. She said nothing the next morning or the morning after. What she did instead was listen. It was not difficult. She had been listening in this house for 6 years, and the servants' passages carried sound the way old stone carries cold. Thoroughly and without effort. Mrs. Pell, who had been senior housemaid at Calderne Court since before Gideon inherited, and who had formed a quiet and mutual respect with Susannah over the matter of Robin's linen being changed properly, confirmed on the 2nd day what the passages had already suggested. The proctor, a Mr. Price from the ecclesiastical courts, had visited the estate twice in the past fortnight. Lord Bertram had been heard in the library discussing a Miss Greaves, of a family Susannah knew by name and reputation. Well-born, well-funded, and sufficiently young to be a practical replacement. Mrs. Pell delivered this information while folding Robin's shirts, without looking up from the work and without being asked for more than she chose to give. Susannah thanked her in a way that required no particular words. On the 3rd morning, she dressed Robin warmly, told the nursery maid that she and the boy were going into the village and would be back by afternoon, which was not a lie, strictly speaking, only incomplete, and sent a brief note ahead by the early post to Mr. Tobias Hawes of Ludwell, her father's former colleague, asking whether he could receive her that day on a legal matter. She had known Tobias Hawes since she was 9 years old. He had taught her to copy deeds on wet afternoons when her father brought her to the office rather than leave her alone in the house, and he had never once treated the copying as a child's game. By the time she was 15, she could read a trust instrument as quickly as he could, and he had told her so, with the blunt appreciation of a man who valued accuracy above almost everything else. The post-chaise south from Calderne took 2 hours. Robin slept against her arm for the first hour and spent the second watching the hedgerows go by, with the focused attention of a 5-year-old who has decided that hedgerows are interesting. Susannah looked at the road ahead and assembled in order every document she had memorized. Hawes's chambers smelled of ink and old paper, and the particular damp that comes from a building that has stood in the same market square for 140 years. And Susannah had always found it the most comfortable smell in the world. She sat Robin at the small table with a pen and a sheet of scrap paper. He was working on the letter R with passionate inaccuracy. And she sat across from Hawes and told him everything she knew. She named the proctor. She described the draft petition's terms, the settlement figure, the custody clause, the timeline. She told him about the Marbury family trust, which she had spent 3 evenings reading in full from the copy lodged with the county solicitor, a matter of public record that no one had apparently thought she would trouble to examine. She told him about the entry she had found in the family register 2 years earlier, in a room she had been given no reason to avoid, in a register that had been left unlocked because no one had imagined she would understand what she was reading. Hawes listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment with the expression he reserved for documents that were simultaneously more complicated and more useful than expected. "You want the judicial separation, not the dissolution," he said. "Yes," Susannah said, "and separate maintenance, and a sealed deposition held against any attempt to remove Robin. The deposition will need to reference the trust irregularities specifically." "I know what it needs to reference," she said. Hawes picked up his pen. "Then let us begin." Robin, at the small table, had produced 7 letter R's of varying confidence and was examining them with the expression of a fair judge. Susannah watched him for a moment, his dark hair, Gideon's jaw, her father's hands, and thought of the wedding breakfast 9 years past. The Marbury family stone-faced at every table, the weight of their collective disapproval pressing down on the white linen like weather. She had looked at them and felt afraid. And then she had looked at Gideon, who had looked back at her and placed his hand deliberately over hers on the table, in full view of every person in the room. A claiming. A declaration made without words, in the plainest language available to him. It had been the last time he touched her, as an act of will rather than obligation, and she had spent 9 years wondering whether she had imagined the courage in it. She had not imagined it. She had simply watched it erode, season by season, under the weight of a family that knew how to be patient. She turned back to Hawes, and they worked until the afternoon light began to fail. The formal notice from Mr. Hawes arrived at Calderne Court on a Thursday, addressed to the Duke of Calderne in a hand that was not Susannah's. Deliberately, Gideon understood, so that he could not set it aside unread as domestic correspondence. Copies went simultaneously to the family solicitor and to the vicar of the parish church. A detail that was not accidental, and that Gideon recognized as the work of someone who understood exactly how information traveled in a county. He read it in the same study where Price had gathered his papers and left. Bertram stood at his shoulder and read it with him, and for once said very little. The Duchess of Calderne and the heir Robin Marbury were now resident at a let house in Ludwell, pending resolution of the petition. The letter named the street and the house. It stated that Robin had been registered with the local physician and the parish clerk. It was, in its entirety, the work of a woman who had not left in distress but had arrived somewhere, and arrived with every intention of staying. Gideon did not send a reply. In Ludwell, Susannah was stacking her father's law books along the wall of the front room, 3 rooms above a chandler's shop on the market square, the smell of beeswax rising pleasantly through the floorboards. Robin had already found the window that looked directly onto the square, and had stationed himself at it to observe the market traffic with the proprietary interest of a boy who considers all horses personally addressed to him. The rooms were small. The plaster was clean, The light in the morning came in from the east and fell across the desk at an angle that Susannah found, without surprise, entirely adequate. She registered Robin with Dr. Fenwick on the Friday and with the parish clerk on the Saturday, and both men noted the name in their books without comment, because she presented herself with the calm, exact manner of a woman performing a routine administrative task, which was precisely what she was doing. The county, meanwhile, had begun to talk. The Duchess of Calderne had gone. The child was with her. The Duke had not followed. By the second week, the talk had acquired the particular quality of scandal that attaches to aristocratic disorder. Half appalled, half avid, entirely relentless. At Calderne, Gideon stood at the study window on the morning of the 12th day and watched his housekeeper cross the courtyard with her usual purposeful tread, and the footman carry coals up the east staircase, and the gardener's boy rake the gravel drive in the thin autumn sun. The house continued. Every mechanism of it ran exactly as it always had, because Susannah had organized its running so thoroughly and so quietly that her absence had not disturbed a single domestic arrangement. He had not noticed, until now, how much of what he took for the house's natural order had been her specific and daily work. It told him more than anything Bertram said. Bertram said a great deal. 3 weeks after the letter, Gideon traveled to Ludwell. He had not sent word ahead. He told himself this was practical, that announcing himself would give her time to prepare a position, and did not examine the assumption too carefully, because the assumption was that she was not already prepared. He hired a chaise from the coaching inn at the county town rather than taking the Calderne carriage, a concession to discretion that felt, on the road south, increasingly inadequate. The house above the Chandlers was not difficult to find. He knocked. A young woman he did not recognize, a hired girl not from Calderne, opened the door and showed him up without particular ceremony. The stairs were narrow. The smell of beeswax was strong and not unpleasant. Susannah was seated at a writing desk in the front room, which was also, evidently, her study, her law library, and her sitting room. Her father's books lined the wall behind her in careful order. She was writing when he entered, and she finished the sentence before she looked up. Not a performance of composure, he realized, but simply the action of a woman who finishes what she has started. "Gideon," she said, and set her pen down. He had prepared, on the road, a reasonable approach. The settlement figure, which was generous. The schooling arrangements for Robin, which were excellent. A tutor at Calderne for the present years, Harrow in due course. The terms that Hawes could review at leisure and would find, Gideon believed, entirely fair. He began with the settlement figure. Susannah reached into the left-hand drawer of the desk, drew out a clean copy of the petition, and set it on the surface between them. "Read the third clause," she said. He read it. The third clause bound the sealed deposition, which he had known existed in general terms, to any legal attempt to remove Robin from her custody without her written consent given before a magistrate. But it was the specific language of the deposition's contents that stopped him. The trust instrument named in full, the Family Council Resolution of 1847, the name Lord Bertram Marbury appearing 3 times. "I was not aware," he began. "No," Susannah said. "You were not." He set the paper down. He tried the schooling arrangements because he had prepared them carefully and because preparation is what a man reaches for when the ground has shifted. Susannah listened to him with the full, courteous attention she gave to everything, and when he finished, she looked at him steadily. "You drew up a life for me without asking whether I would consent to live it," she said. "I have done the same, and I asked a better lawyer." there was no particular heat in it. It was a plain statement of fact from a woman who had spent 9 years being plain in rooms that rewarded obscurity. And the plainness of it was more effective than any eloquence. Gideon had a procedural answer prepared for anger. He had nothing prepared for clarity. He was quiet for the first time since he had arrived, and the quiet sat between them in the small, book-lined room, and did not feel like defeat exactly. It felt like the moment a man realizes he has been arguing with the wrong map. From the inner room came the sound of small feet on a bare floor, and then Robin's voice saying something about a horse. He was always saying something about a horse. And then the boy himself appeared in the doorway, saw his father, and ran. Both of them moved at the same moment, the instinct identical and simultaneous. Gideon's hands came up to catch the boy's shoulders, and Susannah's hands were already there. And for one suspended breath, all 4 hands were on Robin's small shoulders at once, the boy entirely unaware of the weight of what he had just walked into. Neither parent moved. Robin looked up at his father with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to manage his own face. "I have a horse," Robin said with great dignity. "A wooden one. It has a red saddle." Gideon looked down at his son. His hands were still on the boy's shoulders, and so were Susannah's, and the warmth of that, of her hands an inch from his, of Robin's solid and certain between them, was something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. "Show me," Gideon said. Robin pulled free and ran back to the inner room. Gideon straightened. Susannah withdrew her hands and looked at the petition still open on the desk. Neither of them spoke about what had just happened, but neither of them pretended it had not. Bertram had arranged the dinner at Calderne with his usual efficient invisibility. The invitations extended, the seating ordered, the table set with the good silver that came out for important occasions, the occasion itself never named aloud. Miss Honoria Greaves arrived with her mother and her quiet, observant face, and sat at Gideon's right hand, and spoke intelligently about the autumn harvest and the new railway proposals and the novel she was reading, and was in every observable way exactly the sort of woman that the Marbury family required and had always required. Gideon sat through the dinner with the expression of a man performing a duty he cannot name to anyone, including himself. After dinner, Bertram steered them to the portrait gallery with the practiced ease of a man who has arranged rooms for 30 years. The gallery was long and cold, lit by sconces that threw the family portraits into warm relief. Generations of Marburys in their frames, each name on its plate, each face composed for posterity. Near the center of the east wall, between a painting of the 3rd Duke and a formal group portrait of the 4th Duke's family, there hung a landscape, a competent rendering of the Calderne parkland in summer, green and untroubled, in a frame that was distinctly heavier and older than a landscape warranted. Miss Greaves stopped in front of it. "This frame belongs to a portrait," she said, not accusingly, simply as the observation of a woman who notices things. "A painting damaged beyond restoration," Gideon said. It was the household answer, worn smooth with use. Miss Greaves looked at the frame for another moment, then at the plates on either side of it, both reading Marbury, and did not press the matter. She accepted the answer with a small nod and moved on. And Gideon watched her and thought, without knowing why he was thinking it, that she was a decent woman in a position she had not chosen. 2 days later, a county gathering at Ashmore Park brought together, through the mechanism of separate invitations and a hostess who had not coordinated her guest list carefully, both Susannah Marbury and Miss Honoria Greaves. Susannah arrived with Robin, who immediately attached himself to the terrier belonging to the Ashmore children and could not be separated from it by any argument. Bertram, who had come with Gideon, saw the situation from across the room, and moved with the speed of a man who has managed social arrangements for 3 decades. He was not fast enough. Miss Greaves had already crossed the room, and she and Susannah were speaking, quietly, without performance. The way 2 women speak when they have both understood the same thing about a situation and are comparing notes. Robin appeared briefly, introduced himself and the terrier, and disappeared again. Miss Greaves watched him go with an expression that was impossible to read from a distance. Bertram arrived at Susannah's elbow and said something smooth about the weather and the long drive, and whether Miss Greaves had met Lady Ashmore, who was very much wanting to speak with her, just over. "I am perfectly placed, Lord Bertram, thank you," Miss Greaves said. Her voice was pleasant and entirely immovable. Bertram tried again, with the name of someone across the room. Miss Greaves turned to face him with the full, unhurried attention of a woman who has decided to be direct. "I have met the Duchess," she said, "and the boy. And I understand the arrangement you are proposing, Lord Bertram, and I will not be part of it." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was not raised. It did not need to be, because the drawing room had the particular acoustic quality of a room that has gone quiet. I will not be the instrument by which a living wife and her child are set aside. I ask to be removed from any arrangement that requires it. The room heard it. A dozen people heard it, including 3 women who would have it in 4 letters by nightfall. Bertram's color did not change. He was too practiced for that. But something behind his eyes went very still. The look of a man recalculating a sum that has come out wrong. Gideon, standing at the edge of the room near the window, had heard every word. He looked at Miss Greaves, who met his eyes briefly with an expression of complete equanimity. And then he looked at the middle distance, where there was nothing to see except the end of the route he had been following without examining too closely. He had no prepared route forward. For the first time in 9 years, the path that Bertram had always laid out in front of him was not there. The open scandal sharpened into something harder in the weeks that followed, because Bertram had not built his arrangements over 30 years by accepting setbacks quietly. He instructed the family solicitor to issue a legal requisition for the heir's return to Calderne under the father's custodial right, citing the boy's education and the requirements of his station. The requisition was delivered by 2 of the estate's men of business, who arrived at the Ludwell house on a gray November morning with their papers in order, and the particular manner of men who have been told that the matter is straightforward. Gideon arrived at the same moment. He had not been sent for by Bertram. He had been sent for by a note, 3 lines, no salutation, from Mrs. Pell, who had driven through the night from Calderne and whose handwriting, under normal circumstances, was a model of legibility, and was, in this note, not quite steady. He had read it in his dressing room at 6 in the morning and been in the chaise by 7. The 2 men of business were on the step when the chaise arrived. Gideon got down without waiting for the door to be held, and walked to the front of the house and placed himself in the doorway. He did not touch either man. He held out his hand for the requisition, and one of them gave it to him, and he read it aloud on the step in the gray morning light, while the market square went about its business around them. This requisition references the father's custodial right under the common law, Gideon said when he had finished reading. It does not reference the petition for judicial separation currently before the court, which supersedes the common law provision in cases where a sealed deposition has been lodged with the court citing specific grounds. Mr. Hawes anticipated this document. The 3rd clause of the petition's sealed schedule addresses it by name. He refolded the requisition and held it back out. Return this to Lord Bertram. Tell him his own name appears in the sealed deposition, and that he should consider carefully before pressing the point in open court. The 2 men looked at each other. They took the requisition and left. Susannah had been standing in the interior hallway, Robin's hand in hers, watching through the open door. She did not thank him, and he did not ask her to. He looked at her across the threshold, the narrow house, the market square behind him, the cold morning air between them. And she looked back. And what passed between them was not forgiveness and was not warmth, but it was the first honest acknowledgement they had exchanged in a very long time. He went back to Calderne. Susannah closed the door. Some days later, on a gray afternoon when the gallery at Calderne was empty except for the low sound of the wind in the eaves, Robin escaped his afternoon rest and wandered the long room with the systematic interest of a boy who has decided to examine every painting. Mrs. Pell found him standing in front of the landscape with a heavy frame. "The plate says Marbury," Robin said, studying it. "All the others say Marbury too, but they have faces." Mrs. Pell looked at the covered portrait for a long moment. "Who is underneath the paint?" Robin asked. Mrs. Pell took him back to the nursery and gave him warm milk and said nothing to him about the painting. But that evening she went to Gideon's study and told him what the boy had asked, standing in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her and her face entirely composed. Gideon sat with it for an hour. Then he went to the family register room. The register was a large leather-bound volume kept in a locked cabinet, whose key had been in his keeping since he inherited. He had not opened it in 4 years. He turned to the entries for the previous generation and found what he had always known was there and had never looked at directly. The name Lord Crispin Marbury, his elder brother, struck through in a different ink from the surrounding entries, a darker, more deliberate stroke, applied after the fact. Beside the struck name, in Bertram's hand, the date of disinheritance. The cause, also in Bertram's hand, unsuitable alliance, estate interest, by resolution of the family council. Crispin had married a woman of no family, a schoolmaster's daughter. He had married her in a church in Derbyshire on a Tuesday in October, and by the following spring his name had been removed from the register, his portrait painted over, his correspondence returned unopened, and he himself had gone abroad with his wife and not come back. He had died in Lisbon 12 years later, estranged and stripped of his name, and Gideon had inherited the dukedom because of it, had always known this, in the way a man knows the thing he has chosen not to examine. He was still standing with the register open in his hands when he became aware that he was not alone in the gallery. Susannah had returned to Calderne with Robin for the formal visit, required by the petition proceedings, a provision of the legal process that Hawes had inserted deliberately, because it kept Gideon and Susannah in the same building at intervals, and because Mr. Hawes had the strategic instincts of a man who has read a great deal of case law. She had heard the register room door and come to find the source of the light. She looked at his face before she looked at the register. Then she looked at the register. Then she crossed the room and took his right hand and turned it palm up, slowly, the way a person handles something that may be fragile, and looked at the lines of it in the candlelight. "My father taught me to read a man's hands," she said, "to see whether he was telling the truth." Gideon looked at her face, and then at his own hand in hers, and something in the room seemed to change its quality, not warm, not forgiving, but present in a way it had not been. "Crispin married a woman of no family," he said. "Bertram arranged the disinheritance. Crispin died abroad. I inherited because of it." He paused. "I have been repeating it. Everything I was about to do to you. Bertram did it to Crispin's wife first. I inherited a dukedom and a pattern, and I followed the pattern without looking at it." Susannah held his hand a moment longer. Then she released it and walked back to where Robin was waiting in the corridor, and she did not look back, and he did not call after her. Robin's fever came that night. Not the crisis kind, but the kind that sits at 101 and makes a small boy fretful and hot-eyed and in need of both parents without being able to say so. Gideon sat on the left side of the cot, and Susannah sat on the right, and the night moved around them in the particular slow way of nights spent watching a child sleep. Near 4 a.m, Robin's breathing had steadied and deepened, and the candle on the bedside table had burned to a low, wavering inch. Susannah leaned forward to draw the coverlet up more snugly, and Gideon did the same, and their hands met on the fabric above the sleeping boy, her left, his right, both pressing the wool gently down, and neither of them lifted away. The candle guttered. Robin made a small sound in his sleep and settled deeper. Outside, the first birds were beginning in the garden, thin and tentative in the dark. They stayed like that until the candle went out. By morning, the fever had broken, and Robin was asking for toast and whether the wooden horse had been brought from Ludwell, in that order, with equal urgency. In the days that followed, Susannah sat alone in Hawes's chambers in Ludwell and laid the full case on the table in front of herself, the way her father had taught her to examine a brief. Every document in sequence, every implication named aloud, no comfortable omissions. The sealed deposition, the trust instrument, with its 30 years of Bertram's discretionary management, and the specific transactions that did not bear examination. The correspondence between Bertram and Price, which she had obtained through a channel she had not yet explained to anyone. The register entry in Bertram's own hand, which she had copied in full on the day she first read it. "It is sufficient," Hawes said. He was not a man who overstated. "I know it is sufficient," Susannah said. "You could expose the settlement as structured fraud, the forced disinheritance of the elder brother, Bertram's control across 2 decades, all of it." "I know what I could do," Susannah said. Hawes looked at her steadily. "Then what are you going to do?" She sat with the question for 3 days. She thought about Crispin Marbury, who had died in Lisbon with his name struck through in a register he never saw. She thought about Robin asking who was underneath the paint. She thought about Gideon's hand turning palm up in the candlelight, and the look on his face when he said, "I have been repeating it, not eloquent, not performed, just a man seeing a thing he had been looking away from for 9 years. She thought about what she wanted to be, with the power she was holding. On the 4th day, she wrote a letter. It was addressed to Gideon, not to Bertram, not to the family solicitor. It requested his presence at Calderne in the register room at 2 o'clock on Thursday next, with 4 witnesses of her naming: Mr. Tobias Hawes, Mrs. Pell, Miss Honoria Greaves, and the Reverend Marsh of the parish church. The letter stated, in a single sentence that required no elaboration, that Lord Bertram Marbury was not to speak on Gideon's behalf. She sealed it herself and gave it to the post. The register room at 2 o'clock on Thursday held more people than it had been designed for, and a silence more complete than any of them had expected. Hawes stood at the left wall with his document case. Mrs. Pell stood beside him with her hands folded. Miss Greaves stood near the window, composed and watchful. The Reverend Marsh stood at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who has been given incomplete information and is reconstructing the situation from available evidence. The family register lay open on the central table, Crispin's struck name visible from the doorway. Gideon stood at the near end of the table. He had arrived before any of them and had not moved since. Lord Bertram arrived without invitation, which surprised no one. He came in behind Hawes, read the room in a single practiced sweep, and positioned himself at the head of the table with the authority of a man who has occupied the head of every table in this house for 30 years. He did not wait for Gideon to speak. He looked at Susannah, who was standing beside the register, her hand resting on the open page. And he delivered his terms with the measured efficiency of a man who has prepared them carefully and believes they are unanswerable. She was to accept the settlement figure as written. She was to return the boy to Calderne under the terms of the custody clause. She was to withdraw the petition and the sealed deposition and remove herself from the county with the monthly allowance and the access provisions already specified. If she declined, Bertram would instruct the family's legal resources to contest the petition in open court, to attach her father's name to every proceeding through the record of his clerk's work for the Marbury estate. Work that could, in the right framing, be characterized as having served the family's interests improperly, and to pursue the requisition for Robin's return through every channel available to the ducal title. "You will be managed," Bertram said, "as Crispin's wife was managed. And I would suggest you consider carefully what that ending looked like." The room was very still. Gideon had not moved through the entirety of the ultimatum. His face was the face he wore in difficult rooms, composed, faintly weary, the face of a man who has learned to absorb pressure without visible reaction. Every person in the room watched him, because the next move was his. He reached across the table and drew the register toward him. He looked at Crispin's entry. The struck name, the darker ink, the cause in Bertram's handwriting. He stood with it for a moment. Then he took the pen from the standish at the table's edge. In his own hand, in the clear, deliberate script of a man writing something he intends to be read, he restored Crispin Marbury's name. He wrote it in full, Lord Crispin Henry Marbury, above the struck line, and beside it the date of this correction, and his own signature beneath. Gideon Marbury, Duke of Calderne. He turned the pages to the current family entries and wrote Susannah's name as it should always have appeared. Susannah Marbury née Hale, Duchess of Calderne, true wife. Below it, Robin's entry. Robin Henry Marbury, lawful heir. He signed each one. He set the pen down. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, which he placed before Hawes without ceremony. "A formal renunciation of the discretionary trust," he said. "Effective from today. Control returns to the entailed estate. Lord Bertram's authority over the Calderne fortune is removed entirely." Hawes opened the document. His expression did not change, but he read it with the particular focused attention of a man verifying that what he is holding is exactly what it appears to be. Then he took his own pen from his case and began to countersign. Gideon looked at Bertram. "The meeting is finished on your part," he said. Bertram looked at the register. He looked at the document in Hawes's hands. He looked at Gideon's face, and whatever he saw there was sufficiently conclusive. He picked up his gloves from the table where he had set them, and he walked out of the register room, and the sound of his footsteps receded down the corridor and did not return. The room exhaled. Gideon turned to Susannah. He did not look at Hawes. He did not look at the witnesses along the wall, though he was entirely aware of them and intended them to hear. "I am not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I am asking for the right to begin again, to court my own wife as I should have done 9 years ago, without my family's instruction and without expecting your answer tonight. I have spent 9 years protecting a name. I would rather protect a person." The room was quiet. Miss Greaves looked at the window. Mrs. Pell looked at her own hands. The Reverend Marsh looked at the register. Susannah looked at the restored entry, Crispin's name written back into the record, Robin's name in Gideon's careful hand, her own name where it should have been from the beginning. She looked at the document Hawes was countersigning. She stood with all of it for a long moment, and the silence in the room was not uncomfortable, but was the kind that belongs to a decision being made properly, without haste. Then she spoke to the room. To Hawes, to Mrs. Pell, to Miss Greaves and the vicar, directly, as she had always spoken in rooms that expected her to be quiet. I hold sufficient documentation to expose the Marbury family settlement as structured fraud, she said. I am choosing not to file it. Not because this family is owed mercy, but because I have decided who I intend to be, with the power I am holding. She looked at Gideon. I could have unmade your family in an afternoon. I would rather you unmade it yourself. And you have. She named her terms. Her own house in Ludwell, held as property in her name, not a residence by his permission or revocable at his discretion. The sealed deposition remaining with Hawes, not returned, as Robin's legal protection for as long as it was needed. Her own governance of any arrangement she entered, not reabsorption into the Calderne household as it had previously been structured, but a household she and Gideon built together from what remained. These are not requests, she said. Gideon met her eyes. No, he said, they are not. Hawes wrote them down. Gideon agreed to each one without negotiation, because there was nothing in them to negotiate. They were simply the truth of what the arrangement needed to be, stated plainly by the person who had thought most carefully about it. The witnesses began to move toward the door. Mrs. Pell paused to look at the restored register with an expression she did not explain and did not need to. Miss Greaves caught Susannah's eye briefly as she passed and nodded once. The nod of a woman who has done what she came to do and is satisfied. The Reverend Marsh shook Hawes's hand and said something quiet about the parish records, which would need to be updated. Then the room was empty, except for the two of them. Susannah closed the family register. She stood with her hand flat on the cover, looking at the leather surface, feeling the weight of the book under her palm, the weight of Crispin's name restored, Robin's name secured, her own name written in the only hand that could make it permanent. Gideon stood at the far end of the table and did not move toward her, because he had meant what he said about not expecting her answer tonight. And he was a man learning, slowly and at significant cost, to mean the things he said. Susannah crossed the room to him. She kissed him once, slowly, not a return to what had been, because what had been was not worth returning to, but a beginning of something she was choosing to build with full knowledge of the materials available and their limitations. He did not speak. His hands came up and rested at her waist, careful and still, as though he understood that this was hers to give and his to receive, and that the distinction mattered. Outside the register room, the afternoon light was thinning toward evening, and somewhere in the house, Robin was asking Mrs. Pell about supper, his voice carrying the clear, carrying quality of a child who has no reason to lower it. The spring that followed was spare and quiet, as springs are after difficult winters. Bertram was gone from Calderne, gone from the county, gone from the correspondence, gone from the rooms where his voice had been the primary sound for 30 years. The trust was dissolved, the fortune smaller than it had been in a generation, the estate unglamorous and honest and entirely Gideon's to manage for the first time in his adult life. He made mistakes in the management and corrected them, which was a new experience, and found it less terrible than he had expected. The Ludwell house remained in Susannah's name. She spent Tuesdays and Thursdays there, working with Hawes on cases that had nothing to do with the Marbury family. A widow's pension dispute, a tenant's unlawful eviction, the kind of work her father's colleague had always done and had always known she could do. Gideon did not ask her about the cases. She told him about them anyway, over dinner, and he listened with the focused attention of a man who is learning that listening is a skill he was never taught and is now acquiring deliberately. The family register stood open on the library desk at Calderne. Turned to the page where Crispin's name had been restored. Susannah's father's law books were shelved along the ducal library wall between the estate ledgers and the agricultural surveys. And no one remarked on this because there was no one left at Calderne who would have thought it remarkable on a morning in April. When the garden was doing its tentative best and the light came in low and gold through the east windows. There were 2 cups of tea on a single tray on the library table, and Robin's small boots stood side by side at the garden door, where he had left them before running out in his stockings to investigate something urgent in the kitchen garden. And the morning was ordinary and unhurried and entirely, specifically theirs.